Darby family massacre made hardened detectives cry. Grown men who had seen every horror imaginable, reduced to tears by what they found in that quiet suburban home. On a spring morning in 1996, 4 members of the Darby family were discovered brutally murdered in their own house. Margaret, the 72-year-old grandmother; Claire, her daughter and devoted school teacher; Anna, just 14, with dreams of becoming an artist; and little James, only 9 years old, found clutching his favorite toy soldier. But this wasn't a random break-in gone wrong. The front door wasn't forced. Nothing valuable was taken. Someone they trusted had done this. Someone who walked right through their front door and destroyed an entire family in a single night of rage. The police thought they had their killer. The trial made headlines. The community demanded justice. But then the unthinkable happened. The suspect walked free. For nearly 30 years, the case went cold. 4 innocent lives forgotten. A killer unpunished. Until now. A young podcaster named Rachel Quinn has reopened this case, and what she's discovered will shock you. The real killer wasn't a stranger. It wasn't even Claire's violent ex-husband who stood trial. The truth was hidden in plain sight, buried in overlooked evidence, and family secrets that no one wanted to uncover. Because sometimes the monsters aren't strangers who break down your door. Sometimes they're the people you invite to Sunday dinner. Sometimes they're family. What drove someone to butcher an entire family over money? How did detectives miss the real killer for 3 decades? And when Rachel finally confronted him, what did he say that made her blood run cold? Rain streaks down Detective Paul Rowan's kitchen window as he sits alone at his table, trembling hands wrapped around a cold cup of tea. Before him lies a faded crime scene photograph. The Derby family's kitchen, where breakfast still steamed on the counter while 4 bodies lay scattered throughout the house. 27 years later, and he still can't forget the sight that broke every officer who walked through that door. We never deserved to see what they did to those people, he whispers to the empty room, voice cracking with a weight of unsolved guilt. The photograph shows Margaret Derby's homemade pies cooling on the windowsill, prepared for the church fundraiser she'd never attend. In the corner, a child's toy soldier lies abandoned mid-battle, its tiny plastic form a stark reminder of 9-year-old James's interrupted play. Rowan reaches for a locked box containing cassette tapes from the original investigation. Margaret Derby's voice echoes faintly through the static. Family is everything. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Derby's quiet residential streets, where children's bicycles lined driveways and the smell of dinner preparations drifted from kitchen windows. This was the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew their neighbors' names, where front doors were often left unlocked, and where the most exciting news usually involved someone's garden winning a local contest. Detective Paul Rowan had lived in Derby his entire adult life, raising his own children just 3 blocks from the house that would forever change his understanding of evil. Now, decades into retirement, he found himself returning to that kitchen table every rainy afternoon, unable to escape the ghosts of a case that had consumed the best years of his career and left him questioning everything he thought he knew about human nature. The photograph before him captured a moment frozen in time. A kitchen where morning had arrived, but would never truly begin. Margaret Derby's pies sat perfectly arranged on cooling racks, their golden crusts testament to a grandmother's love and preparation for a community event she would never attend. The kitchen table bore the remnants of a family breakfast, Anna's half-finished bowl of cereal, James's barely touched orange juice, Claire's coffee cup with lipstick still visible on the rim. But it was the details beyond the frame that haunted Rowan most. The way Anna's homework lay scattered on the living room floor, pencil marks still fresh where she'd been working on algebra problems the night before. The fort of couch cushions James had built in the corner, complete with toy soldiers arranged in careful battle formation. Claire's teacher bag by the front door, packed with papers she'd planned to grade that evening. These weren't just victims. They were a family with plans, dreams, and tomorrows that would never come. Bows. Spring 1996 had arrived early in Derby, filling Margaret Derby's garden with daffodils and tulips that seemed to dance in the morning breeze. At 72, Margaret possessed the kind of energy that younger women envied, moving through her kitchen with practiced efficiency as she prepared for another busy day of community service. "Anna, sweetheart, you need to eat more than that," Margaret called to her 14-year-old granddaughter, who sat at the kitchen table pushing cereal around her bowl while reading a paperback novel. Anna looked up with a smile that lit up her entire face, revealing the braces she'd gotten just 3 months earlier. "I'm not that hungry, Grandma. Besides, I want to finish this chapter before school." Claire Derby entered the kitchen already dressed for work, her teacher's badge clipped to a navy blue cardigan that had seen better days. At 42, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to navigate life's challenges with grace, even when those challenges included a difficult divorce and the decision to move back into her childhood home with 2 teenagers in tow. "Morning reading again?" Claire asked, ruffling Anna's hair as she passed. "What's it this time?" "It's about a girl who solves mysteries," Anna replied without looking up from the page. "She's really smart and notices things other people miss." Margaret smiled as she pulled another tray of pies from the oven. "Sounds familiar. You've always been good at noticing things, haven't you, dear?" From the living room came the sound of battle. James's elaborate war between his toy soldiers and an invading army of stuffed animals. At 9 years old, James possessed an imagination that could transform any space into an adventure, whether it was the living room couch becoming a fortress or the backyard garden becoming an unexplored jungle. "James, breakfast," Claire called. "5 more minutes, the battle's almost over." "The battle can wait, food can't." Margaret watched her daughter with quiet pride. Despite everything Claire had endured over the past 2 years, the divorce, the financial struggles, the challenge of starting over, she had never lost her patience with her children or her determination to provide them with stability and love. The morning routine in the Derby household flowed with the comfortable rhythm of a family that had learned to work together. Claire helped Anna gather her school supplies while Margaret packed James's lunch, adding an extra cookie with a note that read, "Have a wonderful day, my brave soldier." "Mom, have you seen my art notebook?" Anna asked, rummaging through her backpack. "It's on the counter by the window," Margaret replied. "The one with all your beautiful drawings of the neighborhood." Anna had filled 3 notebooks with sketches over the past year, detailed drawings of houses, trees, people walking their dogs, children playing in yards. She had an artist's eye for capturing moments that others might overlook. The way morning light fell across a porch, the expression on an elderly man's face as he watered his garden, the intricate patterns of frost on winter windows. "Mrs. Henderson says I have real talent," Anna announced, retrieving her notebook. "She wants to submit some of my work to the county art contest." "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Claire said, genuinely pleased. "You've worked so hard on your drawings." James finally appeared in the kitchen, his blonde hair sticking up in various directions despite Claire's attempts to smooth it down. He climbed onto his chair and immediately began negotiating the terms of his breakfast. "And can I have chocolate milk instead of regular milk?" "You can have regular milk now and chocolate milk after school," Margaret countered with the skill of someone who had raised children and grandchildren. "What about half chocolate, half regular?" Claire laughed. "Nice try, kiddo, but Grandma's offer is final." The kitchen filled with the comfortable chatter of a family starting their day. Claire discussed her lesson plans for her 4th grade class. Anna shared gossip from high school, and James provided detailed updates on the ongoing war between his toy soldiers and the stuffed animal rebellion. None of them noticed the car that drove slowly past the house, or the way it paused at the corner before disappearing around the bend. Mid-morning brought Helen Parker to the Derby front door, carrying an empty sugar bowl and wearing the apologetic smile of a neighbor who had once again run short of baking supplies. Helen lived 3 houses down and had been borrowing ingredients from Margaret Derby for over 15 years. "I promise I'll buy extra next time I'm at the store," Helen said as Margaret welcomed her into the kitchen. "Nonsense, you know you're always welcome," Margaret replied, filling Helen's bowl from a large canister. "Besides, it gives me an excuse to hear all the neighborhood news." Helen's eyes lit up. Few things pleased her more than sharing the latest developments from their quiet street. "Well, the Johnsons are finally getting their roof repaired," And Carol Martinez mentioned that her son got accepted to college. That's wonderful news about Carol's boy. She must be so proud. Oh, she is, though she's worried about the cost. Helen paused, studying Margaret's face. Speaking of costs, I hope you don't mind me asking, but how are things going with the family situations? Margaret's smile faltered slightly. Over the past few months, there had been tension within the extended Derby family regarding the old house and what would happen to it eventually. Margaret owned the property outright, having paid off the mortgage years earlier with her late husband's life insurance money. But recent conversations with certain family members had grown uncomfortable. Some people seem to think they have a say in matters that don't concern them, Margaret said carefully. But Claire and the children are my priority. This house has been in our family for 38 years, and I intend to keep it that way. Helen nodded sympathetically. She had heard rumors about Margaret's cousin Gerald making inquiries about the property, suggesting that Margaret was getting too old to maintain such a large house and that it would be better sold and the proceeds divided among family members. Family can be complicated, Helen observed diplomatically. Family can also be greedy, Margaret replied with uncharacteristic sharpness. Then, catching herself, she softened her tone. But let's not dwell on unpleasant things. How's your garden coming along? The afternoon brought its own rhythm to the Derby household. Claire had returned from school and was grading papers at the kitchen table while Margaret prepared dinner. Anna sat cross-legged on the living room floor, working on a new sketch, while James expanded his fort to include additional defensive positions. "Grandma, do you think people can really change?" Anna asked suddenly, looking up from her drawing. Margaret paused in her chopping of vegetables. "That's a very grown-up question, sweetheart. What makes you ask?" "I was thinking about Dad and how angry he gets sometimes. Mom says he wasn't always that way." Claire looked up from her papers, her expression careful. The divorce had been finalized only 6 months earlier, and she was still navigating how much to share with the children about their father's increasingly volatile behavior. "People can change," Margaret said thoughtfully, "but they have to want to change, and they have to work at it every day. Some people find that harder than others." "Do you think bad people know they're bad?" Anna continued. "I think most people believe they're doing the right thing, even when they're not. But that doesn't excuse harmful behavior." James looked up from his fort. "What's harmful behavior?" "When someone hurts another person, either with words or actions," Claire explained. "Like when Tommy pushed Sarah at school and made her cry?" "Exactly like that, though sometimes grown-up harmful behavior is more complicated." Margaret watched her daughter field these difficult questions with patience and wisdom. Claire had grown into a remarkable woman, handling challenges that would have broken lesser people. The decision to return to her childhood home hadn't been easy, but it had provided stability for the children during a turbulent time. "I'm proud of how you've handled everything," Margaret said quietly when Anna and James had returned to their activities. Claire smiled. "I learned from the best. You raised me to believe that family takes care of family." "Speaking of family," Margaret said, her voice dropping slightly, "Gerald called again this afternoon?" Claire's expression tightened. Gerald Latham was Margaret's cousin, a man she remembered as somewhat bitter even during her childhood. He had been making increasingly frequent contact over the past few months, always with suggestions about what Margaret should do with all that space she was wasting. What did he want this time? "The same thing. He thinks I should sell the house and move into a retirement community. Says it would be better for everyone." "Better for everyone or better for him?" Margaret sighed. "I've been thinking about updating my will, just to make sure everything is crystal clear about my intentions." Evening settled over the Derby household with the comfortable routine of a family that had found its rhythm despite recent upheavals. Dinner had been cleared away, homework was spread across the kitchen table, and the television provided gentle background noise from the living room. Claire was helping Anna with algebra when the phone rang. The old rotary phone in the kitchen had been there since Claire's childhood, its cheerful yellow color now faded but its reliability unchanged. "Derby residence," Claire answered. balancing the receiver between her ear and shoulder while continuing to point out solutions to Anna's math problems. The voice on the other end caused Claire's expression to shift from relaxed to tense. She straightened, giving the caller her full attention. "I told you we'd discuss this tomorrow," she said, her voice low but firm. "No, that's not going to work, because it's not your decision to make. I understand you feel that way, but my mother is perfectly capable of making her own choices." Anna looked up from her homework, noticing the change in her mother's tone. Margaret appeared in the kitchen doorway, drawn by the tension in Claire's voice. "Listen, I need to go," Claire continued. "We can talk tomorrow, but my position isn't going to change. No, I don't think you understand. This isn't a negotiation." She hung up the phone and stood for a moment, her hand resting on the receiver. "Gerald again?" Margaret asked. Claire nodded. "He seems to think he has some kind of say in your decisions. I told him he was wrong." "What did he say?" "Things that weren't his place to say." "Don't worry about it, Mom. Some people need to learn that they can't bully their way into getting what they want." Margaret felt a chill despite the warmth of the kitchen. Gerald had always been a difficult person, prideful, argumentative, quick to take offense. But lately, his calls had taken on a different tone, as if he believed he was entitled to have opinions about her life and her property. "Maybe I should talk to him myself," Margaret suggested. "No," Claire said firmly. "Let me handle this. You shouldn't have to deal with his pressure." James wandered into the kitchen, dragging his favorite blanket. "Mom, can you read me a story before bed?" "Of course, sweetheart. Go pick out a book." As James headed toward his room, Claire gave her mother's shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "Don't let Gerald's nonsense worry you. This is our home, and it's going to stay that way." The house settled into its evening quiet, with Anna finishing her homework in her room and James already asleep with his toy soldier tucked carefully under his arm. Claire had finally closed her grade book and was enjoying a rare moment of stillness, sitting with Margaret in the living room as they watched the late news. Outside, the wind had picked up, rustling through the maple trees that lined their street. The weatherman was predicting possible storms overnight, though nothing severe enough to cause concern. "I should probably bring in the porch chairs," Margaret mused, glancing toward the front window. "I'll do it in the morning," Claire offered. "You've done enough for one day." They sat in comfortable silence, each lost in her own thoughts. Margaret found herself thinking about the phone call earlier, about Gerald's increasingly aggressive tone and his apparent conviction that he knew what was best for her. She had known him since childhood. He was the son of her father's brother, but they had never been particularly close. Gerald had always been the type of person who believed the world owed him something, and his periodic appearances in her life usually coincided with his need for money or assistance. Claire was thinking about her students and the lesson plans she needed to prepare for tomorrow's classes. Teaching had always been her calling, and even during the most difficult periods of her personal life, her classroom had provided a sense of purpose and stability. "Mom," Anna called from upstairs. "The streetlight outside my window is flickering again." "I'll call the city tomorrow," Margaret replied. "They've been meaning to fix that for weeks." Through the living room window, they could see the light casting irregular shadows across the front yard, creating an unsettling rhythm of brightness and darkness. The flickering seemed more pronounced tonight, as if the approaching storm was affecting the electrical system. "Maybe I should check all the doors before bed," Claire said, standing and stretching. "Good idea, though I can't remember the last time we had any trouble in this neighborhood." Claire moved through the house systematically, checking the front door, the back door, and the windows on the first floor. Everything was secure, just as it always was. Derby had always been a safe community, the kind of place where neighbors looked out for each other and children could play outside until dark without parents worrying. As she turned off the living room lamp, Claire paused at the front window, peering out at the flickering street light. For just a moment, she thought she saw movement in the shadows across the street, but when she looked more carefully, there was nothing there. Just the wind, she told herself, just the restless night before a storm. The house on Maple Street had never known such silence. It was the deep, heavy quiet that comes in the hours after midnight, when even the most restless sleepers have finally succumbed to dreams. The wind had died down, leaving the air still and expectant, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Margaret Derby lay in her bed, drifting between sleep and wakefulness, as she often did these days. Age had made her a lighter sleeper, more aware of the small sounds that houses make as they settle and shift through the night. The creak of old wood, the whisper of air moving through heating vents, the distant hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen below. But tonight, there was something else, a sound that didn't belong to the familiar symphony of her home's nighttime noises. A soft scraping, barely audible, coming from somewhere downstairs. Margaret opened her eyes, listening carefully. Probably just the wind after all, or perhaps a tree branch scraping against the siding. Old houses were full of mysterious sounds, and after 38 years in this home, she thought she had heard them all. Then she heard it again, a soft click, followed by the barely perceptible squeak of hinges that needed oil. The front door. Margaret sat up in bed, her heart beginning to beat faster. Claire always locked the doors before going to sleep. It was a habit ingrained since childhood. But that sound was unmistakably the front door opening, the same sound she had heard thousands of times over the decades. She strained to listen, wondering if Claire might have gone outside for some reason. Perhaps she had heard something in the yard and gone to investigate. But there were no footsteps on the front porch, no voices, no indication of a normal, explicable reason for someone to be opening their door at this hour. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound had been. Margaret found herself holding her breath, waiting for something, anything that would explain what she had heard. The closing of the door, the sound of Claire's voice, even the family cat, though they didn't have one, knocking something over. Instead, there was only silence, and then, so faint she almost missed it, the soft sound of footsteps on the hardwood floor of the entryway. Someone was in her house. The intruder moved through the Derby house with the confidence of someone who knew the layout, avoiding the creaky floorboard by the bottom of the stairs and the loose rug in the hallway that often shifted underfoot. This was not a random break-in by a desperate stranger. This was someone who had been in this house before, who knew where Margaret kept her spare key, who understood the family's routines and vulnerabilities. In the kitchen, moonlight streaming through the window illuminated the pies Margaret had baked for tomorrow's church fundraiser. They sat in perfect rows on the cooling racks, their golden crusts a testament to hours of careful preparation and love. The knife block on the counter held the set of German steel blades that Margaret had received as a wedding gift 38 years earlier, each one maintained with the care of someone who understood the value of quality tools. The largest knife slid from its wooden slot with barely a whisper. Upstairs, Claire Derby stirred in her sleep, caught in the grip of a dream that seemed to echo with familiar voices calling her name. In her subconscious mind, she registered the subtle shift in the house's atmosphere, the way the air seemed to vibrate with an energy that didn't belong. But sleep held her firmly, refusing to release her into wakefulness until it was too late. Margaret, meanwhile, had managed to convince herself that she had imagined the sounds. Old houses settled, pipes expanded and contracted, and imagination could play tricks in the small hours of the night. She had lived alone in this house for years before Claire and the children moved back, and she had never had any real reason to fear for her safety. But as she began to drift back toward sleep, she heard another sound that froze her blood. The slow, deliberate creak of footsteps on the stairs. Not the quick, light steps of Claire checking on the children, or the hurried bounce of Anna or James heading to the bathroom. These were measured, purposeful steps, the footfalls of someone who was trying to move quietly, but couldn't quite manage complete silence. Margaret reached for the phone on her nightstand, her fingers trembling as she lifted the receiver. But before she could dial, before she could call for help, her bedroom door swung open. The scream that rose in her throat never had a chance to escape. The violence that erupted in the Derby house that night defied comprehension. It was not the quick, impersonal brutality of a robbery gone wrong, but something far more personal and rage-filled. Each victim was found in a different room, suggesting a methodical progression through the house, a deliberate hunting of family members who had awakened to the sound of violence and tried to flee or hide. Anna Derby was discovered at the top of the staircase, her art notebook scattered beneath her, sketches of neighborhood scenes mixing with droplets of blood in a grotesque parody of abstract art. She had been running toward her mother's room when she was caught, and investigators would later determine that she had fought back with the desperate courage of a 14-year-old trying to protect her family. James was found in his bedroom, surrounded by the toy soldiers he had been playing with just hours earlier. The fort he had built from couch cushions had been knocked over in the struggle, and his favorite soldier, the one he always carried with him, lay on the floor beside his small body. The plastic figures seemed to stare accusingly at the ceiling, a witness to horrors no child should ever experience. Claire had made it furthest in her attempt to escape, reaching the back door before she was overtaken. Her teacher's bag lay spilled beside her, papers for tomorrow's lesson plan mixing with the car keys she had grabbed in her desperate attempt to get help, to call police, to somehow stop the nightmare that had invaded her family's sanctuary. Margaret Derby was found in her bedroom, the phone receiver still clutched in her hand. She had tried to call for help, but the call had never connected. Her recipe box lay overturned nearby, index cards covered with her careful handwriting scattered like fallen leaves. Decades of family meals, holiday traditions, and grandmother's love reduced to paper debris in a room that had become a tomb. The house that had sheltered 3 generations of Derby family memories was now a crime scene, its walls holding secrets that would haunt everyone who entered for years to come. And somewhere in the pre-dawn darkness, the killer walked away, leaving behind not just 4 bodies, but the destroyed dreams and futures of an entire family. Helen Parker had always been an early riser, but that morning her routine was driven by anxiety rather than habit. She had lain awake for much of the night, disturbed by what she couldn't quite identify as unusual sounds from the direction of the Derby house. Living 3 houses down, she was accustomed to the quiet rhythms of her neighbors' lives, and something about the previous night had felt wrong. And 7 o'clock came and went without any sign of activity from the Derby household. No lights in the kitchen windows, no movement in the yard, no children's voices preparing for school. Helen's concern deepened into genuine worry. Margaret was always up by 6:30, starting coffee and preparing breakfast for her family. Claire's car should have been warming up in the driveway by now, and Anna should have been walking to the corner to catch the school bus. Helen pulled on her robe and walked to her front window, studying the house that had become as familiar to her as her own. The curtains were still drawn, the morning newspaper lay untouched on the front walk, and the mailbox remained full from the previous day's delivery. Most telling of all, the pies that Margaret had been so excited about, the ones destined for the church fundraiser, were still visible through the kitchen window, but the lights that should have illuminated the morning preparations were dark. Something was very wrong. Helen's hands shook as she dialed 911, the phone receiver slipping slightly in her palm as she tried to explain her concerns to the dispatcher. 911, what's your emergency? I'm not sure if it's an emergency, but something's wrong at my neighbor's house. The Derby family, at 1247 Maple Street. They should be up by now, but there are no lights, no movement, and the front door looks like it might be open, just a crack. Ma'am, have you tried knocking on the door or calling them? And called their phone 3 times, but no one answered, and I don't want to just walk over there in case something bad has happened. The dispatcher's voice became more focused. Ma'am, I'm sending an officer to check on them. Stay on the line with me and don't approach the house yourself. Helen waited by her window, phone pressed to her ear, watching the empty house and feeling her heart pound with dread she couldn't explain. Officer Mike Daniels had been with the Derby Police Department for 12 years. He had responded to domestic disturbances, car accidents, break-ins, and even a suicide. He considered himself experienced, professional, and emotionally prepared for most situations that small-town policing might present. But nothing in his career had prepared him for what he found when he pushed open the front door of 1247 Maple Street. The first thing he noticed was the silence. Houses where families lived were never completely quiet, even in the early morning hours. There should have been the sound of a television, coffee brewing, children getting ready for school. Instead, there was only an oppressive stillness that seemed to press against his eardrums. The second thing he noticed was the smell. It was metallic and heavy, unmistakably the scent of violence and death. Officer Daniels drew his weapon and began a systematic search of the house, following protocol even as his mind struggled to process what he was seeing. The overturned furniture in the living room, the scattered papers and books, the dark stains on the hardwood floors, that could only be one thing. When he found Margaret Derby's body in her bedroom, he had to step outside and take several deep breaths before he could continue. When he discovered Anna at the top of the stairs, he felt his professional composure begin to crack. By the time he reached James's room and saw the child surrounded by his toy soldiers, Officer Daniels was fighting to maintain his emotional control. Claire's body by the back door was the final break in his professional facade. She had died trying to escape, trying to get help, trying to save what remained of her family. Officer Daniels stumbled outside and reached for his radio with shaking hands. "Dispatch, this is Unit 7 at 1247 Maple Street." "Go ahead, Unit 7. We're gonna need everyone. Detective units, coroner, crime scene team." His voice cracked, and he had to clear his throat before continuing. "We have 4 victims, all deceased. This is the worst thing I've ever seen." "Copy that, Unit 7. Are you all right?" Officer Daniels looked back at the house, then at Helen Parker watching from her window 3 houses down. "How do you explain to a dispatcher, to a community, to yourself, that a family has been destroyed in their own home?" "No," he said finally. "No, I don't think any of us are going to be all right." Detective Paul Rowan arrived at the scene within 20 minutes of Officer Daniels' radio call, but even that brief delay felt like an eternity. News of something terrible happening at the Derby house had already begun to spread through the small community, and neighbors were gathering on the street despite police efforts to maintain a perimeter. Rowan had been a detective for 8 years, working his way up from patrol officer through careful attention to detail and an intuitive understanding of how people behaved under stress. He prided himself on maintaining professional objectivity, on seeing crime scenes as puzzles to be solved rather than tragedies to be mourned. But as he stepped through the front door of the Derby house, he felt that objectivity crumble. This scene was unlike anything in Derby's recent history. This wasn't a domestic dispute that had escalated or a burglary interrupted by an unexpected encounter. This was systematic, brutal, and personal. Someone had moved through this house with deliberate intent, hunting down every member of the family. Rowan began his examination in the kitchen, noting the undisturbed breakfast preparations and the pies cooling by the window. The knife block was missing its largest blade, and there were no signs of forced entry through any of the doors or windows. Whoever had done this had either possessed a key or had been let into the house willingly. Jesus Christ, Paul. Detective Sarah Martinez had just arrived, her face pale as she surveyed the scene. Martinez had transferred from a larger city department and had seen her share of violent crimes, but even she seemed shaken by the thoroughness of the destruction. 4 victims, Rowan said quietly, his voice professionally controlled but his eyes betraying his emotion. Grandmother, mother, 2 children, ages 9 to 72. Any obvious motive? Nothing missing that we can see so far. No forced entry. Kitchen knives were used as weapons, but this wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was personal. They worked through the house systematically, documenting every detail, every piece of evidence, every sign of the family's final moments. In Anna's room, they found her diary filled with typical teenage observations about school, friends, and her artistic ambitions. In James's room, they carefully photographed the arrangement of toy soldiers before collecting them as potential evidence. The crime scene photographer, a veteran named Tom Willis who had worked scenes throughout the county for 15 years, had to excuse himself twice during the documentation process. Later, he would tell his wife that he was considering a career change. "I've seen accidents, suicides, even homicides," Willis confided to Rowan during a break. "But this is different. This was a family. They had breakfast plans and homework and toys. Someone walked into their home and destroyed all of that." Roland nodded. Understanding exactly what Willis meant, every crime scene told a story, but this one told the story of interrupted lives, of futures that would never unfold, of a sanctuary violated in the most fundamental way possible. The initial investigation focused on gathering physical evidence and establishing a timeline. The coroner estimated that the murders had occurred between midnight and 2 a.m., based on body temperature and the state of rigor mortis. The killer had moved through the house methodically, starting with Margaret in her bedroom, then proceeding to hunt down the other family members as they awakened to the sounds of violence. What puzzled investigators was the personal nature of the attack. This wasn't the work of a desperate drug addict looking for money to steal, or even a random psychopath choosing victims at random. The level of rage suggested someone with a personal grievance against the family, someone who felt wronged or betrayed. Detective Martinez spent the morning interviewing neighbors, trying to establish whether anyone had seen or heard anything unusual during the night. Most reported sleeping soundly, though Mrs. Patterson, 2 houses away, mentioned hearing what might have been a car door slamming around 2:30 a.m. "Did you see the vehicle?" Martinez asked. "No, I just heard it. Could have been anyone, really. People work different shifts, come home at all hours." Meanwhile, Rowan searched through the family's personal papers, looking for any indication of conflict or threat. In Margaret's bedroom bureau, he found her will, dated just 3 months earlier. The document was straightforward. The house and all of Margaret's possessions would go to Claire, with provisions for Anna and James to inherit when they reached adulthood. But paper-clipped to the will was a letter from Gerald Latham, Margaret's cousin, dated 2 weeks before the murders. The tone was angry and accusatory, suggesting that Margaret was making a mistake by cutting out family who had been there longer and favoring one branch of the family tree over another. "You don't understand the financial burden you're placing on Claire," the letter read. "That house is too much for her to handle alone, and you're being selfish by not considering what would be best for everyone involved. The property should be sold and the proceeds divided fairly among all family members who have contributed to its upkeep over the years." Rowan read the letter twice, noting the increasingly aggressive tone as it progressed. Gerald Latham clearly believed he had some claim to Margaret's property, and he was upset about being excluded from her will. "Martinez, I think we need to have a conversation with Gerald Latham," Rowan called across the room. Gerald Latham lived in a modest apartment on the other side of Derby, in a complex that had seen better days. At 58, he worked as a carpenter when he could find jobs, but steady employment had become increasingly difficult as his reputation for being argumentative and difficult to work with had spread through the local construction community. When detectives Rowan and Martinez knocked on his door that afternoon, Gerald answered with what seemed like genuine surprise at seeing police officers. "Officers, is everything all right?" "Mr. Latham, I'm Detective Rowan. This is Detective Martinez. We'd like to ask you some questions about your cousin, Margaret Derby." Gerald's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something: guilt, fear, annoyance, crossing his features before settling into careful neutrality. "What about Margaret? Is she all right?" "When was the last time you spoke with her?" Rowan asked, not yet answering Gerald's question. "Few days ago, maybe a week, we talked on the phone about family matters." "What kind of family matters?" Gerald invited them inside, his apartment Spartan and neat in the way of someone who didn't have many possessions to organize. He offered coffee, which they declined, then sat across from them with his hands folded carefully in his lap. "Margaret and I had some disagreements about her property. I thought she was making decisions without considering all the family members who might be affected." "Affected how?" Martinez asked. "Well, that house has been in the family for decades. When Margaret passes, and I hope that's many years from now, it seems unfair that Claire should inherit everything when there are other family members who have contributed to its upkeep over the years." Rowan studied Gerald's face carefully. "Mr. Latham, I need to tell you that Margaret Derby was found dead this morning, along with Claire and her 2 children. They were murdered in their home last night." The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Gerald's face went white, his hands began to shake, and he seemed to collapse inward on himself. What? No, that can't be right. Margaret? The children too? Where were you last night between midnight and 3 a.m.? Martinez asked. Here. I was here. I had dinner around 7, watched television until about 11, then went to bed. I'm a light sleeper, so I would have heard if anyone had come or gone from the building. He provided a detailed timeline without being asked for specifics, which struck both detectives as unusual. Most innocent people had to think carefully about their activities from the previous night. The investigation into Joe Latham's background revealed a man with a history of grievances and disappointments. He had been married briefly in his 30s, but his wife had left him after what she described to police as increasingly controlling and angry behavior. He had filed multiple lawsuits over the years, against former employers, contractors who had fired him, even a neighbor who had complained about his loud music. This is a guy who feels like the world owes him something, Martinez observed as they reviewed his file. And when he doesn't get what he thinks he deserves, he gets angry. The phone records from Margaret's house revealed a pattern of increasingly frequent calls from Gerald's number over the past month. The calls had grown longer and more frequent, often occurring late in the evening when Gerald might have been drinking. When they interviewed Claire's principal at the elementary school where she taught, they learned that Claire had recently asked for advice about dealing with family pressure regarding her living situation. She didn't go into details, the principal explained, but she mentioned that a family member was trying to convince her mother to sell the house. Claire was worried because the children had finally settled in after the divorce, and she didn't want to disrupt their stability again. The school secretary added that Claire had received several phone calls at work over the past week, calls that had left her visibly upset and distracted. She usually took personal calls in the office, but these ones she took at her desk. I heard her saying things like, "That's not your decision to make," and "You need to stop calling here." She seemed really stressed about it. Back at the station, Rowan and Martinez built a timeline of the relationship between Margaret and Gerald, tracing the escalating conflict over the property and the will. They discovered that Gerald had recently been evicted from a previous apartment for non-payment of rent, and had been relying on occasional carpentry jobs and what appeared to be loans from family members to make ends meet. "He's broke, he's angry, and he believes Margaret owes him something," Rowan summarized. "She cuts him out of her will and he snaps. The question is, can we prove it?" Martinez replied. They decided to bring Gerald in for formal questioning, hoping that the pressure of a police station interview might reveal inconsistencies in his story or prompt him to say something incriminating. Fiskina was last seen at a Point Plymouth PD. The interrogation of Gerald Latham took place in Interview Room 2 at the Derby Police Department, a windowless space designed to be psychologically uncomfortable. Gerald arrived with a public defender, a young woman named Lisa Chin, who had just graduated from law school and was still learning how to handle major criminal cases. Detective Rowan began the questioning with routine biographical information, establishing Gerald's relationship to the victims and his recent contact with them. Gerald maintained his calm demeanor initially, answering questions in a straightforward manner and expressing appropriate shock and grief about the murders. "This is just so hard to believe," Gerald said, shaking his head. "Margaret was such a good woman. And those children. Who could do something like that to children? You mentioned yesterday that you had disagreements with Margaret about her property," Martinez said. "Can you tell us more about that?" Gerald's posture shifted slightly, becoming more defensive. "It wasn't really disagreements. I was just concerned about her making decisions that might not be in her best interest." "What kind of decisions?" "Well, she was getting older, and that house is a lot to maintain. I thought she might want to consider selling it and moving somewhere more manageable." "And you thought this because?" "Because I care about her welfare. That house is expensive to heat, the roof needs work, and Claire has her own financial pressures. It just seemed like selling might be better for everyone." Rowan leaned forward. "Better for everyone or better for you?" Gerald's lawyer interrupted. "What exactly are you implying, Detective?" "I'm asking whether your client had a financial interest in Margaret Derby selling her house." "Of course not," Gerald said quickly. "I was just thinking about what would be best for the family." But as the questioning continued, Gerald began to reveal knowledge about the family's routines and the house's layout that seemed unusual for someone who claimed to rarely visit. He mentioned that Margaret usually baked pies on Saturday mornings for church events, that Claire graded papers at the kitchen table most evenings, and that James always played with his toy soldiers in the living room. "You seem to know quite a bit about their daily habits," Martinez observed. "I'm family. We talked on the phone." "How often?" Gerald hesitated. "I don't know, a few times a month." But the phone record showed he had called Margaret's house 17 times in the past month, including 3 calls on the day before the murders. The breakthrough in Gerald's interrogation came when he made a seemingly innocent comment about the crime scene. Detective Rowan had been pressing him about his financial situation and his feelings about being excluded from Margaret's will, when Gerald said something that stopped both detectives cold. "Look, I may have been upset about the will, but I would never hurt Margaret. She was a good woman who made great pies. Even that morning, she was probably baking for one of her church things, just like always." Rowan and Martinez exchanged a quick glance. The detail about Margaret baking pies on the morning of the murders had never been released to the public. The media had reported the basic facts, that 4 family members had been found dead in their home, but specific details about the crime scene were being withheld to protect the integrity of the investigation. "How did you know Margaret was baking pies that morning?" Martinez asked carefully. Gerald seemed to realize his mistake immediately. His face flushed and he began backtracking. "I just assumed. She always baked on weekends for church events." "But you specifically mentioned that morning. How would you know what she was doing the morning she was killed, unless you were there?" Gerald's lawyer leaned forward, sensing danger. "My client was making an assumption, based on his knowledge of the victim's habits." "Actually," Rowan said, pulling out a crime scene photograph, "Margaret had baked 6 pies the evening before the murders. They were sitting on cooling racks in her kitchen when we found the bodies. That's a very specific detail that only someone who was in that house could have known." Gerald stared at the photograph, his face growing paler. I just assumed." "You assumed she was baking the morning she was killed, but the pies were actually baked the night before. The only way you could have known about those pies is if you saw them in her kitchen." The room fell silent except for the sound of Gerald's increasingly labored breathing. His lawyer whispered urgently in his ear, undoubtedly advising him to stop talking. But Gerald seemed unable to focus on anything except the photograph in front of him. "Those are her apple pies," he said quietly. "She always made them in those old metal pans that belonged to her mother." Another detail that had never been released publicly. Detective Rowan felt his pulse quicken as he realized they might be on the verge of a confession. "Gerald, how do you know about Margaret's pie pans?" The evidence against Gerald Latham was circumstantial but compelling. His knowledge of details that had never been made public, combined with the threatening letters, the phone records showing escalating contact, and his lack of a solid alibi, convinced investigators that they had identified Margaret Derby's killer. The district attorney, Patricia Wells, reviewed the case files with careful attention to what would be needed for a successful prosecution. Wells had been a prosecutor for 15 years and had handled numerous murder cases, but she understood that circumstantial evidence required a particularly strong presentation to convince a jury. "The detail about the pies is significant," she told Rowan and Martinez during their case review meeting. "But we need to be prepared for the defense to argue that he could have learned about Margaret's baking habits through phone conversations or previous visits to the house." "What about the threatening letters?" Rowan asked. "They show motive, but they don't prove he acted on that motive. We need to build a comprehensive case that shows not just that he had reason to kill Margaret, but that he had the opportunity and the means." The arrest warrant for Gerald Latham was signed on a Thursday afternoon, exactly 1 week after the murders. When police arrived at his apartment, they found him packing a suitcase. "Going somewhere, Gerald?" Detective Martinez asked. "I have a job opportunity in another state, construction work." "I'm afraid that's going to have to wait. Gerald Latham, you're under arrest for the murders of Margaret Derby, Claire Derby, Anna Derby, and James Derby." As Martinez read him his Miranda rights, Gerald maintained his innocence, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of what might have been relief that suggested part of him was glad the charade was finally over. The arrest made front-page news in the Derby Gazette and was covered by television stations throughout the region. The headline read, "Local Man Arrested in Family Massacre," and the accompanying article detailed Gerald's relationship to the victims and his apparent motive for the crimes. The community's reaction was a mixture of relief and horror. Relief that the killer had been caught and was no longer a threat, but horror that someone could murder his own family members over money and property disputes. Helen Parker, the neighbor who had discovered the bodies, told reporters that she felt a little safer knowing he's locked up, but nothing will bring back that beautiful family. The trial of Gerald Latham began 6 months later, in the fall of 1996. The case had attracted significant media attention, not just because of the brutal nature of the crimes, but because it involved a family dispute that had escalated to unthinkable violence. The courthouse was packed each day with reporters, family friends, and members of the community who wanted to see justice served. Prosecutor Patricia Wells opened her case with a methodical presentation of the evidence against Gerald. She outlined his financial troubles, his angry letters to Margaret, the pattern of increasingly aggressive phone calls, and his knowledge of details that only the killer could have known. Gerald Latham believed he was entitled to a share of his cousin's property, Wells told the jury. When Margaret Derby made it clear that she intended to leave everything to her daughter and grandchildren, Gerald Latham decided to take what he thought was rightfully his. But when he got to that house on Maple Street, he didn't just steal property, he stole 4 lives. The prosecution's case seemed strong. They presented the threatening letters, the phone records, and testimony from neighbors about Gerald's increasingly erratic behavior in the weeks leading up to the murders. The medical examiner testified about the brutal nature of the attacks, and crime scene technicians walked the jury through the evidence collected from the house. But Gerald's defense attorney, Lisa Chen, proved to be more formidable than anyone had expected. Despite her inexperience, she had spent months preparing for this case, and she understood that her client's life depended on creating reasonable doubt about his guilt. Chen's strategy focused on the lack of physical evidence directly linking Gerald to the crime scene. No fingerprints on the murder weapon, no DNA evidence, no witnesses who could place him at the house on the night of the murders. The prosecution wants you to convict Gerald Latham based on speculation and coincidence, Chen told the jury during her opening statement. Yes, he had disagreements with his cousin about her property. Yes, he was upset about being excluded from her will. But being upset about family finances doesn't make someone a murderer. Chen systematically challenged each piece of the prosecution's evidence. The knowledge about the pies could have come from previous visits to the house or from phone conversations with Margaret. The lack of a solid alibi was unfortunate, but not unusual for someone who lived alone and had no reason to account for his whereabouts on what should have been an ordinary night. Most effectively, Chen raised questions about the investigation itself. Did the police investigate other possible suspects? Chen asked Detective Rowan during cross-examination. Did they look into Claire Derby's ex-husband, who had a documented history of domestic violence? Did they examine the possibility that this was a random break-in by someone who knew the family's routines? Rowan had to admit that once they identified Gerald as a suspect, the investigation had focused primarily on building a case against him. Other potential leads had not been pursued as thoroughly as they might have been. Chen also pointed out inconsistencies in the timeline and raised questions about whether one person could have committed all 4 murders in the time frame suggested by the medical examiner. The prosecution wants you to believe that Gerald Latham somehow entered that house undetected, found Margaret Derby in her bedroom, killed her, then hunted down and killed 3 other family members before escaping without leaving behind any physical evidence. Does that sound like the work of a 58-year-old carpenter with no history of violence? The defense's strategy was working. Members of the jury seemed troubled by the lack of direct evidence, and several appeared sympathetic to Chen's arguments about the rush to judgment by police. The verdict came on a Friday afternoon after 2 days of deliberation. The jury foreman, a retired teacher named Robert Hayes, stood to deliver the decision that would shock the courtroom and devastate the community. On the charge of murder in the first degree in the death of Margaret Derby, we find the defendant not guilty. The same verdict was repeated for each of the 4 victims. Gerald Latham was acquitted on all charges. The courtroom erupted in gasps and cries of disbelief. Several family friends broke down in tears, and Detective Rowan felt as though the floor had dropped out from under him. Gerald's reaction was strangely muted. Rather than celebrating his acquittal, he simply nodded to his attorney and asked to be escorted out of the courtroom as quickly as possible. Outside the courthouse, Gerald made a brief statement to the assembled media. "I told everyone from the beginning that I was innocent. I'm just glad the jury saw through the police department's rush to judgment. Now I hope the real killer will be found and brought to justice." The Derby Gazette's headline the next morning read, "Latham acquitted in Derby family massacre." The accompanying editorial questioned whether the police had focused on the wrong suspect and allowed the real killer to escape justice. The years that followed Gerald Latham's acquittal were marked by frustration and gradual resignation for everyone involved in the Derby family murder case. Detective Rowan continued to work the investigation sporadically, following up on tips that came in from the public and occasionally re-interviewing witnesses, but no new evidence emerged that could point to another suspect. Gerald Latham left Derby shortly after the trial, reportedly moving to another state where he could start fresh without the constant reminder of the accusations that had been made against him. Despite his acquittal, many in the community continued to believe he was guilty, making it impossible for him to rebuild his life in the town where the murders had occurred. The Derby Police Department received criticism for what some saw as a rushed investigation that had focused too quickly on a single suspect. Detective Rowan in particular struggled with doubts about whether they had missed something crucial in their eagerness to solve the case. The house on Maple Street remained empty for 2 years before finally being sold to a family from out of state who were unaware of its history. When they learned about the murders, they sold the property again, and it changed hands several more times before eventually being demolished in 2003. A small park now occupies the lot where the Derby family lived and died. Detective Rowan retired in 2005, but he kept a box of files from the Derby case in his attic. Occasionally, usually late at night when he couldn't sleep, he would pull out the photographs and reports and study them again, searching for some detail he might have missed, some connection he might have overlooked. The case officially remained open, but it was no longer actively investigated. New crimes demanded attention, new cases required resources, and the Derby family murders gradually faded from public consciousness, except as a cautionary tale about how even the safest communities could be touched by inexplicable violence. But the case never faded from the memories of those who had been closest to it. Helen Parker, the neighbor who had discovered the bodies, moved away from Derby in 2001, telling friends that she could never feel safe in the house where she had lived for 20 years. Crime scene photographer Tom Willis did indeed change careers, becoming a high school photography teacher who specialized in landscapes and portraits, anything that didn't involve documenting human tragedy. And Detective Rowan continued to wake up some mornings with the faces of Margaret, Claire, Anna, and James Derby in his mind, wondering who had stolen their lives and whether justice would ever truly be served. 27 years after the Derby family murders, a young woman named Rachel Quinn was setting up recording equipment in the cramped bedroom she had converted into a makeshift studio. At 32, Rachel had built a modest but dedicated following for her true crime podcast, Voices for the Voiceless, which focused on cold cases and unsolved murders throughout the Midwest. Rachel had grown up in a neighboring town, and she remembered hearing whispers about the Derby murders when she was a child. But her interest in the case had become personal when she learned that her Aunt Linda had been murdered in a similar unsolved case in 1994, just 2 years before the Derby killing. The frustration of watching her family struggle with unanswered questions had driven Rachel to become an investigative journalist, determined to give voice to victims whose stories had been forgotten. The Derby case represented everything that frustrated Rachel about the criminal justice system. A family had been destroyed, a community had been traumatized, and despite what seemed like a clear suspect, no one had ever been held accountable for the crimes. Rachel had spent 3 months researching the case, reading through old newspaper articles, court transcripts, and police reports that had been made available through public records requests. She had also reached out to people who had been involved in the original investigation, though most had been reluctant to discuss the case. The breakthrough had come when she finally convinced Detective Paul Rowan to meet with her. Rowan had initially declined her requests for an interview, but Rachel's persistence and her obvious dedication to finding the truth had eventually worn down his resistance. "If you're going to open this door," Rowan had warned her during their first phone conversation, "you better be ready for what's behind it. This case destroyed a lot of people, not just the victims." Their first meeting took place at a coffee shop in downtown Derby, away from the neighborhood where the murders had occurred. Rowan had arrived early and was sitting in a corner booth when Rachel entered, carrying a digital recorder and a notebook filled with questions she had been preparing for months. "Detective Rowan, I'm Rachel Quinn. Thank you so much for agreeing to see me." Rowan looked older than his 68 years, with gray hair and eyes that seemed to carry the weight of difficult memories. He gestured for Rachel to sit across from him. "Before we start," he said, "I want you to understand something. This case has haunted me for almost 3 decades. There isn't a week that goes by that I don't think about Margaret Derby and her family. So if you're just looking for entertainment value, you can leave now." Rachel had come prepared for Rowan's skepticism and resistance. She understood that retired detectives were often protective of their old cases, especially ones that had ended without resolution. "Detective Rowan, I'm not here for entertainment. My Aunt Linda was murdered in 1994 and her case was never solved. I know what it's like to have questions that never get answered, and I know what it does to families when killers go free. I want to help find the truth about what happened to the Derby family." Something in Rachel's tone seemed to convince Rowan that her motives were genuine. He studied her face for a long moment, then reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder of his own. "If we're going to do this, I want a record of what I say. Too many times, reporters twist words or take things out of context. Of course, I want to be completely accurate." Rowan pressed record on his device, then nodded for Rachel to do the same with hers. "The Derby family murders were the worst thing I ever saw in 30 years of police work," Rowan began. 4 innocent people, 3 generations of a family, killed in their own home by someone they trusted. And after all these years, I still believe we know who did it. Gerald Latham, but believing it and proving it are 2 different things. Rachel had prepared extensively for this interview, but hearing Rowan's conviction about Gerald's guilt was still powerful. Despite the acquittal, despite the years that had passed, Rowan had never wavered in his belief that they had identified the right suspect. "Can you walk me through what happened that night?" Rowan's expression grew distant as he began to recount the details of the case. He described receiving the call from dispatch, arriving at the scene, and the systematic way the killer had moved through the house. "Whoever did this knew the family's routines," Rowan explained. "They knew Margaret slept in the back bedroom. They knew Claire's room was at the top of the stairs. They knew where the children slept. This wasn't a random break-in." Rachel asked about the evidence against Gerald, and Rowan outlined the timeline of escalating conflict, the threatening letters, and Gerald's knowledge of details about the crime scene. "But the jury acquitted him," Rachel pointed out. "The jury made a mistake. They focused too much on the lack of physical evidence and not enough on the circumstantial evidence that clearly pointed to Gerald." After her interview with Detective Rowan, Rachel began reaching out to other people who had been connected to the case. Many were reluctant to talk, either because they wanted to put the painful memories behind them or because they were concerned about legal implications of discussing an unsolved murder case. But Helen Parker, now 84 years old and living in a retirement community 2 towns away, agreed to meet with Rachel after some initial hesitation. "I've never gotten over finding them," Helen admitted when Rachel visited her small apartment. "Even now, almost 30 years later, I sometimes wake up thinking about that morning." Helen had maintained a journal for most of her adult life, recording daily observations about her neighborhood, the weather, and the small events that made up her routine. Rachel asked if she still had the journal entries from the time period around the murders. "I kept all of them," Helen said, retrieving a box of small notebooks from her bedroom closet. "I couldn't bring myself to throw them away, even though reading them brings back painful memories." Together they went through the entries from the weeks leading up to the murders. Helen's neat handwriting documented ordinary neighborhood activities. Who was having roof work done, which children were selling Girl Scout cookies when the garbage trucks came through the street. But in the entry for the night before the murders, Rachel found something that made her pulse quicken. Helen, look at this entry. You wrote, saw Gerald's truck parked on Elm Street around 11 p.m. Seemed odd since he doesn't usually visit that late. Did you ever tell the police about this? Helen studied the entry, her face growing pale. I don't remember writing that, and I don't think I ever mentioned it to the police. There was so much chaos after we found the bodies, and I was so upset. Elm Street ran parallel to Maple Street, 1 block over. Someone parked there could easily walk through the backyards to reach the Derby house without being seen from the front of the property. Helen, this is important. You saw Gerald's truck in the neighborhood the night of the murders, and you never told anyone. I must have forgotten. After finding the bodies, everything else seemed unimportant. I was focused on what I had seen that morning, not what I had seen the night before. Rachel felt her excitement growing. This was potentially crucial evidence that had been overlooked during the original investigation. If Helen had seen Gerald's truck in the neighborhood on the night of the murders, it directly contradicted his alibi that he had been home all evening. If Eli armed with Helen Parker's journal entry about seeing Gerald's truck, Rachel began digging deeper into records that might corroborate or contradict this new information. She spent hours at the county clerk's office, searching through vehicle registration records from 1996. Gerald Latham had indeed owned a dark blue Ford pickup truck during the time period in question. The registration showed that he had purchased the vehicle in 1994 and had kept it until 1998, when he apparently sold it before leaving Derby. Rachel also discovered that Gerald had received 2 traffic citations in the 6 months before the murders, both for parking violations in neighborhoods where he claimed he never visited. One citation was issued just 3 blocks from the Derby house, suggesting that Gerald had been in the area more frequently than he had admitted to police. When Rachel called Detective Rowan to share this new information, his reaction was immediate and intense. Helen saw his truck in the neighborhood that night. Are you absolutely certain about this? She wrote it in her journal. The entry is dated the day before the murders, and she specifically mentions seeing Gerald's truck on Elm Street around 11 p.m. There was a long silence on the other end of the phone. Finally, Rowan spoke, his voice heavy with regret and frustration. We never asked her about the night before. We focused on the morning when she found the bodies, but we never thought to ask what she might have seen in the previous 24 hours. It was an understandable oversight, Rachel said, trying to be diplomatic. No, it was a failure. A crucial failure that might have made the difference in getting a conviction. Rachel could hear the pain in Rowan's voice, the weight of knowing that a critical piece of evidence had been missed during the original investigation. Detective Rowan, it's not too late. Gerald is still alive, and there's no statute of limitations on murder. If we can build a strong enough case with this new evidence, maybe the district attorney would consider reopening the investigation. Either 27 years? After he was already acquitted? Rachel, you don't understand how the legal system works. Double jeopardy means he can never be tried again for these murders, no matter what new evidence we find. The reality of the legal situation hit Rachel like a physical blow. Even if they could prove beyond any doubt that Gerald Latham had murdered the Derby family, he could never be prosecuted for the crimes. So he just gets away with it? Forever? In the legal sense, yes. But there are other kinds of justice. Rachel spent 2 weeks tracking down Gerald Latham's current address. He had moved several times since leaving Derby, eventually settling in a small town in Missouri, where he lived alone in a trailer park on the outskirts of the community. At 75 years old, Gerald was reportedly in poor health and rarely left his home except for necessary errands. Rachel knew that confronting him directly was risky both legally and personally, but she also knew that this might be her only chance to get answers for the Derby family and for the community that had been haunted by their unsolved murders for nearly 3 decades. She drove to Missouri on a Thursday morning, arriving at Gerald's address around noon. The trailer park was shabby and poorly maintained, with several abandoned units and overgrown lots. Gerald's trailer was one of the smaller ones with peeling paint and a broken front step. Rachel sat in her car for several minutes, gathering her courage and reviewing the questions she wanted to ask. She had brought a small digital recorder which she activated before getting out of the car. Gerald answered her knock after several minutes, opening the door just enough to peer out at her. He was much thinner than he had been during the trial, his face gaunt and his hair completely white. He looked like a man who had been carrying a heavy burden for a very long time. "Mr. Latham, my name is Rachel Quinn. I'm a journalist, and I'd like to ask you some questions about the Derby family murders." Gerald's reaction was immediate and telling. His face went pale, and he began to close the door. "I don't talk to reporters. I was acquitted of those charges 27 years ago." "I know you were acquitted, Mr. Latham, but I've found some new evidence that I think you should know about." Gerald paused, his hand still on the door. "What kind of evidence? Can I come in? I think this conversation would be better held in private." After a long moment, Gerald stepped back and allowed Rachel to enter his trailer. The interior was sparse and clean, with little furniture and no personal decorations. It felt like the home of someone who was waiting to leave. Rachel sat on the couch while Gerald remained standing by the door, as if he wanted to be ready to escape at any moment. "Mr. Latham, a neighbor saw your truck in the Derby neighborhood on the night of the murders. She wrote about it in her journal, but she never told the police because she forgot about it after the trauma of finding the bodies." Gerald's face remained impassive, but Rachel noticed that his hands began to shake slightly. "Lots of people had trucks like mine. She was probably mistaken about whose truck she saw. The neighbor knew you, Mr. Latham. She had lived on that street for 15 years and had seen you visit Margaret many times. She specifically identified it as your truck." For several minutes, they sat in silence. Gerald seemed to be weighing his options, considering how to respond to this new information. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet and strained. "What do you want from me?" "I want the truth. The Derby family deserves that much." Gerald walked to the window and stared out at the empty lot next to his trailer. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You have no idea what it was like growing up poor while Margaret lived in that big house. My father worked himself to death trying to make ends meet, while Margaret's father inherited everything and lived comfortably." Rachel remained silent, sensing that Gerald was beginning to open up about feelings he had kept buried for decades. "I helped maintain that house for years. I fixed the roof, painted the siding, repaired the furnace, and what did I get for it? Nothing. Not even a thank you most of the time. Is that why you killed them?" Gerald turned from the window and looked directly at Rachel for the first time since she had arrived. "I went there that night to talk to Margaret, to make her understand that I deserved something for all the years I had helped her. I wasn't going to hurt anyone. I just wanted what was fair." Rachel's heart was pounding, but she forced herself to remain calm and encouraging. "What happened when you got there?" "Margaret was awake. She heard me come in and started yelling at me, telling me I had no right to be in her house. She said she was going to call the police and have me arrested for breaking and entering." Gerald's voice grew stronger as he continued, as if finally telling his story was providing some kind of relief. "I tried to explain that I just wanted to talk, but she wouldn't listen. She kept yelling and I was afraid she would wake up the whole neighborhood, so I tried to quiet her down." "You killed her?" "I didn't mean to, but once it happened, I couldn't take it back. And then Claire came downstairs and she saw what I had done and she started screaming." Rachel felt sick as she listened to Gerald describe hunting down and killing each member of the family one by one as they awakened to the sounds of violence and tried to flee or hide. "The children?" she managed to ask. Gerald's face crumpled, and for the first time he seemed to fully comprehend the magnitude of what he had done. "Baby Xana tried to protect her little brother, but I couldn't leave any witnesses. I couldn't let them tell people what I had done." The confession continued for another 20 minutes, with Gerald providing details about the murders that matched the crime scene evidence perfectly. He described using Margaret's kitchen knives. He mentioned the pies she had baked. He even talked about James's toy soldiers and how the boy had been clutching one when Gerald found him in his bedroom. When Gerald finally finished talking, he seemed exhausted, as if the weight of carrying this secret for 27 years had finally broken him. "Are you going to turn me in?" he asked. "I'm going to share this conversation with the police and with the families of the victims. They deserve to know the truth." Gerald nodded slowly. "I've been waiting for this day for almost 30 years. Part of me is relieved it's finally over." Rachel's final podcast episode about the Derby family murders was released on a Tuesday morning in September, exactly 28 years after the crime had been committed. She had spent weeks carefully crafting the episode, working with legal experts to ensure that she could share Gerald's confession without violating any laws or ethical guidelines. The episode began with the now familiar voice of Helen Parker reading from her 911 call from that terrible morning in 1996. 911, what's your emergency? I think something's wrong at my neighbor's house. The Derby family at 1247 Maple Street. Rachel's narration picked up from there, guiding listeners through the entire story. The discovery of the bodies, the initial investigation, the trial and acquittal of Gerald Latham, and the decades of unanswered questions that had haunted the community. But the centerpiece of the episode was Gerald's confession, played in its entirety with only minor editing to remove some of the longer pauses and to clarify certain details. Rachel had wrestled with the decision to include such graphic content, but she ultimately decided that the full truth needed to be told. For 28 years, the Derby family has been remembered primarily as victims of an unsolved crime. Rachel said in her closing remarks, but they were so much more than that. Margaret Derby was a grandmother who baked pies for church fundraisers and opened her home to her daughter and grandchildren during a difficult time. Claire Derby was a dedicated teacher who put her students' needs above her own and worked hard to provide stability for her children after a difficult divorce. Anna Derby was a talented artist with dreams of becoming an illustrator. And James Derby was a little boy who loved toy soldiers and building forts, and had his whole life ahead of him. The response to the podcast episode was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours of its release, Rachel's inbox was flooded with messages from listeners expressing shock, grief, and gratitude. Many were people who had lived in Derby during the 1990s and remembered the murders, while others were true crime enthusiasts who had been following Rachel's investigation. But the most meaningful response came from Detective Paul Rowan, who called Rachel just hours after the episode went live. "Rachel, I want you to know that you've given them back their dignity," Rowan said, his voice thick with emotion. "For 28 years, the Derby family has been defined by how they died, but your podcast reminded people of how they lived. And that's what really matters." The story was picked up by major news outlets within days of the podcast's release. The confession made headlines across the region, and several television stations sent crews to Derby to interview people who remembered the case. Gerald Latham was found dead in his trailer 3 days after the podcast was released. The coroner ruled it a suicide, and he left behind a written statement that corroborated everything he had told Rachel during their recorded conversation. On a crisp October afternoon, Rachel Quinn stood in the cemetery where the Derby family had been buried 28 years earlier. She carried with her a small plastic toy soldier that Detective Rowan had given her, the same figure that had been found beside James Derby's body and had been kept as evidence all these years. The 4 graves were marked with simple headstones that bore only names and dates, but someone had recently placed fresh flowers by each marker. Rachel had learned that several community members had been quietly maintaining the graves for years, ensuring that the family was not forgotten, even when their case seemed hopeless. Margaret Derby, 192419996, beloved mother and grandmother. Claire Derby, 195419996, devoted teacher and mother. Anna Derby, 198219996, talented artist and loving daughter. James Derby, 198719996, forever our little soldier. Rachel knelt beside James's grave and carefully placed the toy soldier next to the fresh flowers. It seemed like such a small gesture, but it felt profoundly important, a way of returning something to a child who had lost everything. As she stood up, Rachel noticed an elderly woman approaching from across the cemetery. It took her a moment to recognize Helen Parker, who had driven from her retirement community to visit the graves after hearing Rachel's podcast. "I've come here every year on the anniversary," Helen said quietly. "I felt like someone should remember them, should make sure they weren't forgotten." "They'll never be forgotten now," Rachel replied. "The truth is finally out there." They stood together in comfortable silence, two women separated by decades but united in their desire to honor the memory of a family that had been destroyed by greed and violence. "Do you think it helps?" Helen asked. "Knowing the truth, I mean." Rachel considered the question carefully. Gerald Latham's confession had provided answers, but it couldn't bring back the lives that had been lost or heal the trauma that had affected so many people. "I think it helps us remember them as people rather than just victims," Rachel said finally. "And I think it shows that the truth has a way of surfacing, even after almost 30 years. As they prepared to leave, Helen pointed to something that Rachel hadn't noticed before. Near the cemetery entrance, someone had planted a small garden with 4 different types of flowers: roses for Margaret, daisies for Claire, sunflowers for Anna, and small blue forget-me-nots for James. "The community did that," Helen explained. "After your podcast aired, people wanted to do something to honor them." Rachel felt tears welling up in her eyes as she looked at the simple but beautiful memorial. The Derby family murders had begun as a story about violence and injustice, but they had ended as a story about remembrance and the power of community to heal. As she drove away from the cemetery, Rachel thought about the message she had received that morning from a teacher in Derby who had started a scholarship fund in Claire Derby's name for students interested in pursuing careers in education or the arts. The fund had already raised enough money to provide scholarships for 2 students, ensuring that Claire's legacy of nurturing young minds would continue. The Derby family massacre had made detectives cry, had traumatized a community, and had remained unsolved for nearly 3 decades. But in the end, the truth had emerged, and the victims had been restored to their rightful place as beloved family members, rather than nameless statistics in a crime report. Justice, Rachel reflected, sometimes comes in forms we don't expect. Gerald Latham would never face trial for his crimes, but he had died carrying the full weight of his guilt, and his victims had finally received the dignity and remembrance they deserved. The toy soldier would remain beside James's grave, a small sentinel, watching over a little boy who had been loved deeply and was now remembered well. And on quiet afternoons, when the wind rustled through the cemetery trees, visitors might imagine they could hear the distant sound of children's laughter. Not haunting, but joyful, as if the Derby family had finally found peace. The Derby Family Massacre, It Made Detectives Cry podcast became one of the most downloaded true crime series of the year, bringing renewed attention to the importance of thorough investigation and the power of community in seeking justice. Rachel Quinn received numerous awards for her investigative journalism, but she always maintained that the real victory belonged to Margaret, Claire, Anna, and James Derby, a family who had finally been remembered for how they lived rather than how they died. Detective Paul Rowan, now able to find peace after decades of carrying the weight of an unsolved case, began working with other retired officers to review cold cases using modern investigative techniques and fresh perspectives. His work helped solve 3 additional murders that had gone unsolved for over a decade. The former site of the Derby House, now a small community park, was dedicated as a memorial garden where families could gather safely and children could play without fear. A small plaque near the entrance bore a simple inscription: "In memory of the Derby family, Margaret, Claire, Anna, and James. May their love and light live on in our community." And in classrooms throughout Derby, teachers continued to inspire young minds, just as Claire Derby had done, proving that the best way to honor victims of violence is to continue living with purpose, compassion, and hope for a better tomorrow.